Because of time constraints, we are going straight into the panel with Professor Wallach and with Thomas. I have some questions for you that I would like to address. There is one for you, Thomas, regarding the property of EDF. The question is this a private or a state-owned company?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. So EDF historically was a state-owned company, 100% owned by the French state, and now it has been transformed into a private company, but the state still owns 85% of the shares. The employees own 5% of the shares and 10% is on the stock exchange. So let's say it's a private company owned at 85% by the French state, to answer your question.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. You mentioned some of the institutions that were created to face the energy transition, particularly the Ministry of Ecological Transition. Can you explain more about this and other institutions that have been created in order to coordinate all the actions regarding the energy transition?
Yes, I mean, yeah, historically in France, we had a Ministry of Energy, like in many countries. And in the years 2000, with the debate in Europe and in France regarding the energy transition, energy and energy transition has been merged to create one single ministry to make sure that the Ministry of Energy was also responsible for climate change and was able to take the policies, the appropriate policies to handle the energy strategy of the country and considering the effect on climate change at the same time. That's at the ministerial level. And then, as I said in my presentation, we also created the regulator when France decided to unbundle the electric sector as in other European countries. So the equivalent of the CNE in Chile. And then we also have another institution which is called ADEME, which is an agency which is monitoring the effect of climate change and energy efficiency in the country. So not only for the electric sector, but for all sectors in the economy. But this agency, ADEME, is also part of the discussions on the energy policy made by the French government. And then you have other committees which are monitoring the progresses of the energy policy in France, the policies of climate change. So you have a couple of committees which are basically gathering people from different ministries or different organizations to supervise that the objectives determined in the law are actually met by the organizations.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I've got some questions for you, Professor Wallach. The first one relates to how would you address this process that optimizes day-ahead operating costs with climate change resiliency? The question refers particularly to the situation that suffered Texas recently.
Yeah, I mean, what happened in Texas was there's a paper on my website that goes into that in gory detail. But what happened in Texas is a failure they basically do not have a long-term resource adequacy mechanism in Texas. It's called a high price. And they also essentially have a retail market where they assume demand is responsive to the wholesale price, but it's not. So both of those things they learn. So essentially, those would be the two big issues that I would say is that I'm a big fan of there is a need for a long-term resource adequacy mechanism if you have a offer cap on the short-term market, which even Texas does. It is $9,000. And the other is that if you're going to expose customers to the real-time price, they need to understand that that means they will face the real-time price if these sorts of conditions occur. And those were two things that did not occur in Texas, which led first to the problems that they face. So you can't assume that people will reduce their demand if they don't know how to reduce their demand. The long-term resource adequacy mechanism, I think, is as discussed in the paper, I think is certainly a missing ingredient in the ERCOT market, given that they do have this offer cap on their short-term market.
This is particularly important for example, for Chile, because we have a very long country, so resilience is important, and also for the future, the adequacy with a market base in generation. Future power plants are decided by the market in terms of technology, location, when they are going to connect. So in the future, the replacement of coal-fired power plants with renewable, particularly in the north, means that the strength of the system is reduced. So we need to face that to provide signals. What's your opinion about those signals in terms of adequacy? I think it's very important for Chile, looking at our weakness that we'll face in the future.
Well, I mean, to the extent that you retain the capacity mechanism, I think that, you know, if what you have is a capacity mechanism with that must offer obligation, with the fact that if you fail to offer in your capacity at the sort of the availability that you are, you know, designated to be able to meet, you will either be penalized, as happens in the Eastern market, you get your firm capacity amount reduced, or your capacity payment will be clawed back, as occurs in other markets. And, you know, if you then get scheduled in the day ahead market, you will be subject to the imbalance charges. I think that should, you know, that should provide very strong incentives to just give a contrast to in Texas. In Texas, the only thing that happened to the generators that did not supply during the period that the short-term price was $9,000 is they didn't get to earn $9,000. But if there had been a must-offer obligation and they had offered in and failed to provide in a period when the price was $9,000, they would be on the hook to essentially purchase the power that they essentially failed to provide at that $9,000. So I think that higher powered incentive right there would have caused them to weatherize their units, would have caused them to actually be there, would have caused them to actually declare the natural gas infrastructure that served them as essential facilities and not have the electricity supplied to those facilities curtailed, which meant that they didn't get gas at their units. So it's the importance of both the carrot, which is the potential high price, and the stick, which is if you don't, you will be subject to a very large imbalance charge. I think that will, that should really help.
Thank you very much. I've got another question about the market monitoring. Who is in charge of the independent market monitoring in California? Is it an independent organization only for the electricity sector, or it has a role in other markets?
It is only for the electricity. So each of the, as I said, each of the ISOs in the US has an independent market monitor that is typically outsourced to, so for example, in California, it is called the Market Surveillance Committee. It's a committee that I chaired for since from 98 to roughly 2012. It was composed of 3 independent members who had no sort of financial interest in the market. Other markets will have a company that is independent that sells market monitoring service. So for example, PJM has marketing analytics as their market monitor. You know, the other ISOs have different companies that they use for this service. And as I said, the advantage here is that because they are independent, their payment depends upon providing useful information to the stakeholder process that essentially revises the market rules and amends the market rules, and rather than internal to the ISO. And some of the ISOs even have internal market monitoring processes, but those typically are, as I said, very much more inward looking to help the management of the ISO.
Thank you very much. I've got a final question for you about the markets. Do you believe the cost-based day-ahead introduction is a must before thinking in offers, another market?
I certainly do. And the reason is that if Chileans are anything like Americans, definitely. In the following sense of there's lots of things that can go wrong in an offer-based market. And so I think it's very important to essentially go slowly. And just to give you an example, even PJM, the star of the LMP markets in the United States, they went about 6 months as a cost-based LMP market while they worked out the kinks in their LMP market design. So I would think that particularly for Chile, that makes a lot of sense, just because the world will change in extremely important ways if you go to bid-based. And the simplest way to think about it is, in a cost-based market, the imperative for you to learn anything about your competitor is pretty limited. But in an offer-based market, understanding what your competitor is doing is the key to the success of you in this market. And so there can be some initial problems that may not be in the interest of consumers if you don't sort of go, at least I think, go slowly.
Okay, thank you very much. And
Sure.
I've got a final questions for you both about France and about the United States. Because of the more distributed generation coming into the distribution grid, what's your opinion about the creation of special entities like the distribution system operators in order to face the challenges and the coordination with the transmission system operator or transmission owners or the ISOs? Perhaps, Thomas, you can start.
Yes, I mean, in France, the case in France is a bit specific because the distribution operator is basically, there is basically one single operator. For 95% of the customers in France, there is one entity. And this entity, to accommodate the surge of distributed generation capacities, is basically working directly with the transmission grid through these regional schemes to anticipate the connection and to facilitate the connection of these small generation sources. But there is no creation of new entities at the regional level or at the local level to facilitate this integration. Basically, the national distributor will take care of that. They will have, of course, regional, they already have regional concessions for each region of France, but they are all integrated in one single strategy to accommodate these distributed generation of sources. And the tools are mainly legal and regulatory to make sure that every potential consumer or producer, small consumer, small producers, can connect easily to the distribution grid. But no creation of new entity is foreseen so far in France.
Okay, thank you, Thomas.
I actually showing a paper from my website that's looking at this question, and actually for the case of France, believe it or not. And my advice would be is price the distribution grid efficiently. In other words, most of what's going on in terms of why people want to have distributed generation is because of inefficient pricing of retail electricity. In other words, you are layering in an average cost component to recover the cost of the transmission grid and the distribution grid, rather than pricing the energy that comes from the transmission and distribution grid at marginal cost and recovering the cost, the sunk costs of the distribution grid at essentially through a fixed charge or some other way of recovering it. And it's, as the data from all the markets around the world is, the levelized cost of energy from a grid scale solar or a grid scale wind is significantly less than the levelized cost that you get from a distributed solar or distributed wind facility. The only big reason that people are doing these investments in distributed solar is because of the way that we're pricing retail electricity. So my argument would be for Chile, get out in front of this, fix how you price retail electricity, because if you want to get the most renewable energy for the dollar that you spend, it's going to come from the transmission connected renewable energy. And what this paper that I am showing up here does is it actually looks at the case of distributed investments in France. And the one sort of surprising result that we find is that because of the fact that there's so much intermittency in wind and solar in the distribution grid, it's difficult to identify any savings that you would get in terms of distribution network capacity or upgrades associated with the installation of, say, distributed generation. Now, it's true, what we see is that for dispatchable distributed generation investments, we see that does actually reduce the amount of investments that you need in the distribution grid. But for intermittent renewables such as wind and solar, very little, if any, benefit on the peak utilization of the grid. And even with substantial investments in batteries, we don't see much. So those would be my two prescriptions: is fix the pricing of retail electricity to get marginal costs to customers of grid supplied electricity, recover the cost of the transmission and distribution grid through connect charges rather than through average cost-based pricing, because you're just creating this margin for distributed generation to come in and essentially give you a more expensive source of renewable relative to grid scale renewable.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallach. Well, in terms of time constraints, I would like to thank you in the name of SIGRE Chile. Thomas, thank you very much. Professor Frank Wallach, thank you very much. And thank you to Professor Michael Pollitt. So I would like to conclude this block and go to the coordination. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Juan Carlos, y a todos los panelistas. Muy interesantes las conversaciones y las informaciones que nos han compartido.